Serious rural folk, what is the most creepy thing you've seen or experienced? I was in northern Wisconsin with my family as a kid. While I was up there I went on a little hike with my brother and dad, just sorta going through some woods. Ended up emerging from them onto someone's property, and the dude there saw us, came up with his kid and asked the obvious, what ya doing on my property? My dad just apologized and said we were hiking and that he shouldn't have been so careless. We went back quickly, and while the encounter was odd, it didn't feel tense or anything. My brother and I also learned a good lesson about respecting private property. However, dude we encountered was apparently not satisfied. I get it to some degree. If I lived outside an urban area I'd be sussed too if someone emerges from the forest onto my property. Things got weird though. The guy we encountered actually got some goon who either worked for or was related to him to track us back to our cabin. About 5 minutes after we got back and started to make lunch, this goon literally waltzes inside the cabin and begins to talk about how we were caught trespassing. He wasn't yelling or angry or anything, but it was still pretty jarring having some camo wearing guy that you've never seen before to just barge into your grandparents' house. He didn't have a lot of time to say much because our grandparents owned a few guns, mostly antiques though, and sure enough one got pulled on him. Our grandma held this guy up, and actually apologized again for the prior instance of trespassing. Then she started to yell at him though for following us, trespassing on our property, and straight up coming inside uninvited, and then he left. Was a really weird encounter. Have talked to my dad and brother about it on occasion though, so it wasn't a dream or my imagination. Either way, don't trespass. That's the lesson I learned. Yeah, never occurred to me before that a kookaburra laughing would probably scare the shit out of a foreigner hearing it for the first time, especially if they're out in the bush alone. Should also add that the one of the most unexplained things that I've been told about is from my sister's fiancé. Said that him and his brother got chased by a Min light one night years ago when they were driving down to Brisbane from Blackwater. Said this light kept following them from behind a bit of a distance off. He said he then watched it go off into the bush next to the road and still kept on following them while darting around trees. So he starts yelling at his brother who was driving to get out of there as fast as possible. They were apparently booking it and this light was still keeping up with them while darting around the trees and bush. Then it just starts getting further back and then disappears. I've never seen it personally, but he does seem a little shaken up by it, haha. My uncle used live way out in the country on a plot he said was a little less than 8 acres. His closest neighbors weren't terribly far away, within quick driving distance, but also just far enough that walking wasn't very viable. Anyways, I spent my 8th grade summer there and he had one story that scared the shit out of me back then. He had an array of animals on the farm, 3 hunting dogs, pigeons, dozens of chickens, other various birds, a few goats and a lone horse, and every night he would make his rounds through his farm just to make sure everybody was where they were supposed to be and that everything was locked up. One night as he's walking back to his house, his dogs start going wild. He initially doesn't give care to it and continues on his way, but his dogs are just relentlessly barking. He points his flashlight around and doesn't see anything. He gets to the back door of his house, his dogs still barking, and so he turns around one last time. Way out in his fields he says he does see what looks like a moving shadow. He automatically assumes it's a coyote or some other wild animal and just goes inside. The next night as he goes out to make his rounds, he said he was immediately stopped as he spotted some sort of shadowy figure just a little distance away from his barn. He didn't say anything, but he did take out his gun. Again, his initial thought was maybe a coyote trying to get his chickens. However, as he took a few steps, he said the figure suddenly stood up, almost human-like, and ran into the field, covered in darkness. Okay, this is awful, so, trigger warnings, or whatever. It's also a bit long, but that's because there's a lot to this. I still can't believe it all happened. From about age 8 to 11, my family lived in the woods, up in Northern California. We were hippies, sort of, combo hippie/rednecks. Also, I'm oldish, so when I was a kid, there was no cell phones or internet. There was no cable and we had no TV, or electricity for that matter. Kids would just hang out, for fun, and since this was the 70s, we were mostly unsupervised. One of the kids in the group I hung out with was a kid I knew as Dennis. He was a year older than me, and I liked him. I had my first tiny crush on him, actually. Goofy, quiet but fun, interesting. He taught me to ride a dirt bike, and we used to go cruising around together, me on the back. One day we were riding around, and Dennis said he had to swing by his place to get something. I'd never been to his house, but my brother had, and he came back with stories about Dennis' dad being really creepy, in a sexual way. He liked when Dennis brought his male friends over, but hated when girls came along. He'd give the boys pot and beer, and show them porn. My brother was freaked out and didn't go there again. On this day, Dennis made me wait outside. He said Ken would be really angry if I came in. At the time, they lived in a trailer, sort of, in the middle of nowhere up a dirt road, with a tall wire fence, and a dog in the yard outside that barked at me non-stop as I waited for Dennis. Ken stood at the window and stared at me with an angry, pouty look on his face. It was weird as hell. Dennis eventually came back out, and we left. I tried talking to Dennis about his dad, but he shut down and would not discuss it at all. When I turned 12, we moved, and I lost touch with Dennis. Then, when I was 14 or 15, my mom sat my brother and I down and said she had something to tell us. She said that the kid we knew as Dennis was actually named Stephen. That the man we thought was his father, Ken, had kidnapped Dennis when he was only 7 years old. He'd told Dennis that his parents didn't want him anymore, and had given him to Ken to raise. Dennis was heartbroken, but believed it after a while, because what else could he do? He was only 7. Ken molested Dennis for 7 years. He raped him, and this is a quote from Ken himself, thousands of times. I can't even think about it, it makes me so fucking angry. My friend lived in that hell, the prisoner of a sadistic child rapist. When I was a child, 2 of my friends and I decided to explore around an abandoned house that was down the road from us. Typical abandoned house look, paint peeling off everywhere with exposed wood in some spots, plants/vines overgrown, broken windows, roof tiles missing here and there. Well, we walked inside and it matched the outside, cupboards broken, floorboards splintered and cracked. Other than the place being extremely empty, we didn't really get any scary vibes from it. Nothing really stood out to us as paranormal as we'd expect. So we leave the house mildly disappointed. We're walking alongside of one of the windows when this very well-dressed, well-groomed man, maybe in his 60s wearing a black dress coat, white shirt and black tie comes into view. We didn't see him inside, never heard anything. Yet here was this man just staring at us blankly through the window. Friends and I booked it as fast as we ever ran out of there and back home. It probably was just one of the property owners that just happened to be inside the same day we were. There were a few rooms we didn't go in, but good God that scared the shit out of us lol. A few years later the local fire department burnt the place down in a controlled burn, so if it was paranormal, welp it's gone now lol. My brother and I were home alone watching TV. He had an inflatable, life-size Stone Cold wrestler in the basement. When you punched it, it would pop back up and say things like "'cause Stone Cold says so." So we're watching TV, and we know it's just us at home when suddenly we hear "'cause Stone Cold says so" coming from the basement. Very creepy since the thing wouldn't talk on its own. Something had to have moved it, and we were home alone. We both just looked at each other and ran downstairs to see what was happening. My dog had Stone Cold horizontal by the waist, and poor Stone Cold was rapidly deflating, water from the bottom weight dripping into the carpet like clear, white blood. My dog's eyes were glazed over from the glory of the kill, and he'd periodically give Stone Cold another shake for good measure. You see, my brother had been chasing my dog with Stone Cold for about 2 weeks and my dog was very afraid of this inflatable man. I only wish I'd seen him working up the nerve to approach and kill him. Rip inflatable stone cold. I had just turned 16 and was driving home in the middle of nowhere at night on a back road that had trees on both sides. At one part in the road, the tree line on the left side briefly clears. When I got to that part of the road, I saw 5 large, almost perfect circles of fiery yellowish-orange light high in the sky just hovering. 2 were close to each other more to the left, and the other 3 were aligned more to the right, but all were relatively close. No movement from them, no sound, nothing. Again, these were large glowing circles. They looked nothing like the dot of light you'd see from an aircraft or anything. After about 15 seconds of driving, the tree line got dense again, so the sky was once again blocked from my view. I was about 30 seconds from the end of the road, and as I reached the end and the trees cleared again, I had about another 10 seconds worth of viewing the mysterious lights before they got slightly brighter and then disappeared pretty much instantly and simultaneously. To this day I still have no idea what I saw. Again, this was in the middle of nowhere, hours from any major city. No known military facilities or government entities or anything like that nearby. I've rattled my brain on every logical theory possible: fireworks, missile tests, meteors, military aircraft, etc. None of them makes sense. The whole experience was so eerie, and the fact that it's still unexplained weirds me out to this day. Born and bred in the city, have been living here my entire life. Just before COVID started, I thought it would be a fun idea to rent a cabin in the woods to completely disconnect from life/work/. So I found a cabin, with a beautiful deck, which was only accessible through a couple of back roads. Drove 45 minutes, an hour through the woods without seeing anyone. Anyway, first evening goes great. I cook myself a nice dinner, have a couple of drinks, etc. etc. It's snowing heavily, so I pour myself another glass, wrap myself in 2 thick blankets and go outside on the deck to smoke a nice stogie. Let me tell you something, as someone who's used to city noise, the silence of the deep woods is terrifying. I couldn't see much except for trees, but it was as if the primal part of my brain switched on and ran on overdrive. I'm not superstitious at all, but I felt like every cell in my body was screaming, "You're being watched, you might not be alone here, go back inside where you're safe." Of course nothing happened, and after the first week I enjoyed the quietness, but still. You hear so many new sounds. You totally get why our ancestors believed in demons, banshees, wendigos. Got stalked by a lone wolf for a few months, that was great. Never once aggressive to me though, but he was big. I live on southeast side of a lake in northern Ontario. In the winter when the lake freezes, wolves come across the lake from the northwest, usually in packs, and hunt the local wildlife, mostly rabbits I think, which are abundant. Well, one year I guess one wolf didn't make it back across the lake before it melted. We had a early spring thaw, and he was around for the summer. There's no street lights on my road and my friend lives about 1 kilometer up the road from me. After work we'd go to their place for beers almost daily, to be honest, then I'd just walk home after. For weeks I felt like I was being followed/stalked. I'd turn around quick and point my flashlight, and once or twice I got a quick glimpse of yellow eyes. At that point I never seen one here in the summer. In the winter, yeah, going for a rip on a sled sometimes you catch a glimpse in the distance. Anyways, one night after weeks of this happening, I borrowed a trail cam off of a MNR guy we do service work for, put it on the road not far from my buddy's place. After a few days I pick it up, and sure fucking enough there was a big black fucking timber wolf following behind me by like 1 to 2 minutes every night. This really freaked me out, but I had solace knowing that if it wanted to attack me it probably would have already. All the same, I started driving to my buddy's place instead of hoping a ride and walking back, until one night I had far more than my usual 2x after work beers. I say fuck it, grab a flashlight out of my truck and start to walk instead of drinking and driving. I'm walking, there's maybe a 3/4 moon behind me coming through the trees. It's light enough for me to see without my flashlight, and I have it off as per the norm. I'm about halfway home. I don't see him at first, and it was fast in my mind. All of a sudden his eyes got lit up by the moon behind me. the wolf was walking on the opposite side of the road, walking in my direction 15 to 20 feet in front of me. I don't know what the hell made me say it, but I just kept walking and just said, "Yo," as we passed, and the wolf kind of just grunted and carried on. Every year since then there has been a lot less rabbits in our area. I'm guessing he cleared out a lot of the population that summer. I used to live in the desert for a year, and on nights when the moon isn't out or there are clouds blocking out the stars and moon, it's almost pitch black, you can't see more than 10 yards ahead of you. One night I was driving down the highway going home, and then suddenly in my headlights I see a guy running on the side of the highway full on sprinting. I'm going 70 miles per hour, so it's only for a second or two, but I'm like, what the hell was he running from? I hope he's okay because I'm not pulling over LMAO. But then maybe a minute later I see another guy in my headlights, only he's walking on the side of the highway, and I swear to God it looked like the same guy, two separate guys in the dark walking / running on the side of the highway. What possible reason could explain that? I didn't see any cars on the side of the road that might have broken down. I was so weirded out I just had an uncomfortable feeling the entire ride home. Not rural, in the burbs. But my parents' house landlocked, which means it does not have direct access to the road. You have to go through someone else's property to access theirs. Currently, this is a parking lot that belongs to a park. My parents have kept their property natural. Means they despise yard work, so they basically have a house in the middle of the woods next to a park. I was coming home one night a few years ago. It was dark, between 10 to 11 p.m. I come around the corner to come up the driveway and immediately slam on the brakes. There was this tall thing coming out of the darkness, right next to the driveway, and it was moving. It was taller than my car and super skinny. I fucking thought Slenderman was coming for me. As I sat there in shock, my eyes adjusted. It was a blue heron. A big giant bird. It had come up from the creek at the park looking for food, I guess. Scared the hell out of me. My little brother and I were tossing a baseball around near dusk at the bottom of our property, 30 Wooded Mountain Acres Way, Indiana, the middle of nowhere. It had gotten dark enough that we were just about to call it quits when we heard the single most horrifying scream we've ever heard, before or since, from the trees just beyond the edge of the clearing. Imagine a woman screaming in mortal agony, writhing in the most wretched torment imaginable, every tortured scream from horror movies, war movies, anything you've ever heard, nothing compared to this. Even now, decades removed from hearing it, the hair on my arms and neck stands up just thinking of it, and it's made even worse by the realization of what it actually was. A mountain lion. Full-grown female mountain lions scream loudly when they're in heat, and it sounds like a human woman being torn to pieces by the devil himself. To hear that, 2 kids alone in the dark in the middle of nowhere, was about as terrifying as it gets. So I live in the city, but I'd call myself quite an accomplished outdoorsman when I can get away from the city life. A few years ago, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles, 8,500 kilometers, around the US. At night, I most often preferred to wild camp, simply finding somewhere to disappear into the woods, somewhere people were unlikely to find me and even less likely to care that I was there. It ended up being one of my favorite parts of the whole trip, just finding some secluded spot in the woods to get some much-needed rest. But the forest, I quickly learned, is not a quiet place at night. There's always some form of noise. The chirping of thousands of crickets becomes a constant drone throughout the night, accompanied by many toads. There would always be at least a slight breeze through the trees, or the babbling of a nearby creek. It was always a highlight of my nights, though not particularly uncommon to hear the distant yips and howls of coyotes, and I fondly look back on the one night where 2 owls, one on either end of my tent, called back and forth through much of the night. After a month or so of this, I became quite accustomed to the nighttime sounds of the forest, and it became very comforting. So it was quite a shock to my system when one night in rural Montana, I realized I was struggling to sleep because of the exact opposite of what keeps most people up. That night, it wasn't the noise that was keeping me awake but rather the complete lack of any noise. It was dead silent. And that was an incredibly unnerving experience. I can only describe it as the loudest silence I've ever heard. It almost felt as if the entire forest was hiding from an equally silent predator. Suddenly the occasional snapping of a twig, a common sound that would normally get lost in the cacophony of the forest, sounded like a gunshot. I slept terribly that night, and morning could not come soon enough. So a long time ago, I was at a friend's ranch-style house on a little bit of land and it was time for me to head home. Walked outside and it's close to midnight but the moon is almost full so it's really bright. I'm parked back in the sticks a little bit so took me a second to get there, and as I near my truck I hear like a low growl/snort and this beating of feet against the ground. Super loud but not as loud as a horse nor as steady. Just kept getting louder and louder. I get a little freaked out so I run to my truck and fumble my keys getting them out of my pocket and they fall to the ground just like some horror movie. I bend over to grab them and that's when I see something about as tall as my waist round the end of my pickup bed. I immediately knew it was a fucking werewolf and that was it for me. So this beast just slams into me, knocks me to the ground and jacked up my elbow. That's how I met Cookie the Great Dane. Apparently she belonged to an elderly couple about 40 acres over and would get bored and get out of the fence. I ran in to grab my friends and we played with her another hour before I headed home. Cookie become a staple around the ranch house and she always would wait for us when we pulled up. Side note, is it weird or has anyone else had interactions with unknown creatures and just thought GD, that's a monster? I'm fucked, for like just a split second? Seems like I have a bunch of those.